Good morning, everyone. We're so happy to have you here this morning. My name is Sarah Ketchen-Lipson, and I'm on the planning committee for the Depression on College Campuses Conference. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our first presenter for the day. His name is Evan Rose, and he's the co-founder and president of the Steve Fund, which is the nation's only organization focused on supporting the mental and emotional well-being of college students of color. Evan came up with the idea of starting the Steve Fund after the passing of his brother and best friend, Steve, who died from mental illness in 2014. Steve received a master's in psychology and was deeply supportive of the well-being of others. The Steve Fund is the legacy of a gifted, loving, and compassionate young man who felt called to help others. The fund works with colleges and universities, outstanding nonprofits, researchers, students, emerging adults, mental health practitioners, experts, and groups serving diverse populations to stimulate dialogue and promote effective programs and strategies that build understanding and assistance for the mental and emotional health of the nation's students of color as they enter and matriculate and transition into higher education. Its core pillars are knowledge building, programs and partnerships, youth engagement, and tech innovation. The Steve Fund's work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Diverse Magazine, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Huffington Post, and the Harvard Crimson. Evan graduated from Harvard College in 2009, and he currently lives in New York with his wife and dog. Please join me in welcoming Evan Rose and our distinguished group of panelists from the Steve Fund.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for that introduction. That's terrific. I may be going over some of the same things, so you guys should probably take notes now because there's going to be a quiz later, and I hope you're prepared. But I wanted to say it's a pleasure just to be here with all of you guys. We only started 2 years ago, and so to be here at this conference is truly amazing. And I wanted to first of all obviously thank the University of Michigan Depression Center for your leadership and all the trailblazing work that you're doing. Also just a word of thanks to our amazing experts on this panel, who I'm honored to say are experts and advisors to the Steve Fund. And I also wanted to share with you guys our one purpose. You know, our one purpose is to promote the mental health and emotional well-being of students of color. And we think that the access to mental health support should be a fundamental expectation that's enjoyed by all, and not an accident of circumstance, socioeconomic status, or luck. We feel that colleges and universities have a major part to play in building equity in mental health, cultivating the talent our nation needs, and supporting the mental and emotional well-being of those students, especially those students who may be underrepresented groups on campus. In some cases, these are the students who are at serious risk because population-specific factors influencing their mental health are under-researched and poorly understood. So we started this work actually as a result of, as you heard earlier, the tragic loss of my brother, my best friend, and my role model. And it was Steve's courage that inspired us to go out and to attack these issues. So what we're doing is we're connecting with students, we're connecting with practitioners, we're connecting with researchers, leaders of colleges, and communities to do just that. And I know that many of you here today actually have committed your lives to supporting the mental health and wellness. And we thank you guys, and we stand with you. So it's really important actually to serve the needs of our nation's students of color, because research shows that students of color are significantly less likely to seek help and psychological support when faced with mental illness. They're less likely to seek help when depressed. They're twice as likely to say that they're less prepared and emotionally for college than their peers. And in part because of these challenges, they're 1/3 less likely to complete college. So let that marinate for a second. 1/3 less likely to complete college than their peers due to these mental health specific factors. And so we're about changing all that. With minorities forming the majority of Americans by 2044, the future success of our nation depends on the mental health of all students. So we'll be relying on our colleges and universities to use all of their resources to support these groups. So I wanted to also talk a bit about the Steve Fund's priorities. So we're creating a knowledge base, both online and off, through our events and symposiums. And at these events, these are places where students, administrators, researchers, and mental health professionals can share research, programs, best practices, and experience. Something magical happens when you put a bunch of people in a room with passion and knowledge and with the will to do something. Second, we're strong believers in the power of partnership and the democratizing influence of technology. So, with a few people actually who you'll hear speak, or who you may have already actually heard speak, we're talking about creating a number of different programs. So with Crisis Text Line, we're creating a text-based hotline for mental health support for students of color. We're recruiting and training a group of young people of color to become crisis counselors, and a unique keyword will provide access to free 24/7 support, all via text. With the JED Foundation, we're supporting research and will soon be proposing guidelines for colleges to better address the mental health needs of students of color. Our collaboration aims to create evidence-based suggestions for action colleges and universities should take. We're also piloting an online emotional support service in partnership with 7cups.com to respond to young people of color seeking dialogue and support. And finally, we're pleased to be partnering with the following great organizations to support research by students themselves on the mental health of young people of color. Those organizations are Active Minds, the National Latino/Latina Psychological Association, the Association of Black Psychologists, and the Asian American Psychological Association. All this is just to say that together, we're going to make stuff happen, and we're beginning to move the needle. This year, we'll hold our third Young, Gifted, and At-Risk conference since we started in 2014, and I know that those of you who've been in the room have felt the energy. Most of you should come. We welcome you all. Now, just to get a little bit more digital for a second, I wanted to talk about our hashtag, #AskAboutSteve. I know some of you guys may be asking, what does that even mean? And to get right down to it, what it means is that these are issues that affect people's lives. They affect our families. They affect your brothers, your sisters, your children. These aren't anonymous people. So the hashtag really means to ask me about Steve. Ask me about him. I'm happy to talk about it. You know, I'm done with the stigma. I'm done with people not speaking about it. If you ask me about him, I'll tell you he was hilarious. He was an amazing person. He was smart. He was kind. He was compassionate. He was the person who crossed me up 8 times every Sunday. You know, I still deal with those scars today. And I think when you ask about him, though, you have to remember that there are many others out there like him. And they're out there and they're suffering behind smiling masks. So when we started this organization, it was actually, I've told a few of you, as a result of a Tumblr post. And out of that Tumblr post came an outpouring of support, but more importantly, it became an outpouring of people sharing their issues and their concerns and the things that they were dealing with their families or themselves. And so to me, every time I get a text or an email from a stranger or even a friend who's going through things and they're saying that the work that we're doing with the Steve Fund can help them to better seek help or feel more comfortable seeking help or even help them to feel more comfortable getting help for their loved ones, that warms my heart, honestly. And it lets me know that our work that we're doing with our partners and with our experts is incredibly important work, and we're all pushing in the right direction, and we're making some headway. So as I close, I just wanted to thank you guys again for your incredible dedication and your ideas and everything that everybody's doing in this room to promote mental health and well-being. And I'd like to turn it to Dr. Alfiee Breland-Noble and our experts to begin the panel.
All right, good morning, everybody. Okay, we're gonna try again, all right? I happen to be a Black Catholic. We're like unicorns, very rare. But I grew up in the Baptist tradition, okay? My son is actually, I shouldn't say that because that's his little private thing, but my spouse is Baptist, my daughter is Baptist, so we're gonna try again. In Black Baptist Church, for those of you who don't know, we believe in call and response, all right? We're an ecumenical family. Like, I'm Catholic, he's Baptist, but we have 2 churches. So when I say good morning, you say it nice and loud. So I can feel your energy and then I can be excited and keep going, okay? We'll try again. All right, good morning. Good morning. Awesome, thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, so it is truly a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. I have to stop and say this because she has been amazing and I'm gonna totally embarrass her. I don't see her, but she's around here somewhere. I just wanna thank Trish Meyer for and all of the amazing people. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm at the Oscars and I'm not naming somebody's name, but all of the people who worked on the planning committee and staff. I ran a conference a year ago. My colleague, Dr. Rivera, is about to help run the same conference, and I know it's a ton of work, so I just want to say thank you for how welcoming you've been to us, representing the Steve Fund. The Bell Tower is an awesome place. I guess that's a advertisement. I didn't mean to, but it's really been very nice. So we want to thank you. And secondly, I just want to talk a little bit about just an introduction and provide an overview for what we're going to talk about today. So my colleague, Mr. Evan Rose, has done a wonderful job of sharing with you about the Steve Fund. Most of us up here wear 2 hats, but the hat we're wearing today is with the Steve Fund. And while the outgrowth and the beginnings of it are very touching and tragic, I think what has grown out of it is something that I learned from a mentor called Dr. Carl Bell, who's a community psychiatrist at the University of Illinois, Chicago. That's my guy. He's been awesome to me as a mentor and a sponsor and just wonderful. And what he talks about is turning learned helplessness into learned helpfulness. And I feel like that's what's happened with the Steve Fund, is they have taken something and really turned it into something very powerful to benefit our young people of color. So let me ask first, by a show of hands, undergraduate or graduate students, do we have any present today? Stick them way up high. Be proud you're a student. Very good. Okay, you can put them down. So at the end, we're going to honor Trish's wishes to make sure we have an interactive discussion. I'm looking at the time. I could be super long-winded, so I'm going to try my best. I did well at the research meeting. They gave us the charge of 5 to 7 minutes. I did 7 minutes and 33 seconds, so I was like, yes. So I'm doing good, so I'm going to try to do it again today. But toward the end, we're going to have our distinguished colleagues answer your questions, and I'm going to pose some questions to the panel. And so with that, let me go ahead and move through my slides relatively quickly, and then I'll introduce my colleagues. So why are we here? Well, you all know why we're here. You know why this is important. In the general context of students of color, of students broadly defined, but in the specific context of some of the challenges that students of color have faced on college campuses nationwide. So at the research meeting the other day, I was speaking to how moved I was by that photo of the University of Missouri football team, right? Racially diverse, all young men sitting there with their arms crossed, like really kind of defiant, like we are not going to take this anymore. You all need to do something, and how powerful that image was and how much solidarity it demonstrated for this racially diverse group of young people who were really standing up and fighting for the needs of the students of color on that campus, not just the student athletes, but all students of color and all students in general. And so thinking about what these young people have articulated as their demands. So anyone who hasn't seen it, I encourage you to go to thedemands.org so that you can have a clear understanding of what our young people of color nationwide are arguing for and requesting, and in many cases demanding, hence the name of the website, The Demands. And they're talking about things that you all are probably very familiar with, and that it's not a surprise to anybody in this room. I'm preaching to the choir, essentially. So they're asking for things like diversity of representation, right? There's this great hashtag, I use it all the time. I love Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Dr. Alfiee. I love it. The Steve Fund is on Twitter. I think Dr. Rivera is on Twitter. There are quite a few folks out here who are on Twitter. And so when you look at that hashtag, representation matters, people are really speaking to this idea. I need to see people who look like me. And I need to see them doing all kinds of things, not just the negative things. I want to see positive things. So when I see Viola Davis be the first African-American woman, I was flabbergasted. I just learned this. I'm late. To win an Emmy as a lead actress. I wanted to pass out because I'm thinking, well, she looks like me. We're both chocolate brown, and she's beautiful, and she's leading something, and it's positive, although some of the storylines are a little iffy, but that's another story. You know, but she's an actress, and she's acting, and you know, she's playing a role, and so that representation matters. And for our young people, they want to see themselves reflected on these campuses at all levels. So I've been places where the most diverse representation is in environmental services. Right? That's not the only place we can be represented. We should be presidents. We should be deans. We should be RAs. We should be graduate assistants. Young people need to see us reflected everywhere, and I think that's a part of what they're articulating. The more I see it, the more welcomed and comfortable I feel in my environment. So there's some other examples up here. If you haven't looked at it and you want to be shocked, I would look at the recent events from an African-American student at San Diego State University. Where the one thing I'll mention is that on multiple occasions, his roommates put a bike lock around his neck. It was really horrifying, but these are some of the kind, and that's not even a microaggression, that's a macroaggression. But these are some of the things that our young people are dealing with, where we really want, with the Steve Fund, to try to support and help them learn how to fight back when necessary, in the right way, but also to advocate for themselves, and more importantly, to manage self-care, coping, and helping themselves to feel better and adjust emotionally. Another thing I wanted to mention that we're working on is a collaborative effort with the JED Foundation. You all, I won't click it because I'm scared I'll mess up the slides, but we have a recent infographic that we put together with our wonderful colleagues at the JED Foundation that speaks to, as Evan mentioned in his points, how students of color are feeling on college campuses, right? This is what they're reporting their personal experiences and feelings are. And so they're articulating things like they feel less academically prepared. They feel less emotionally prepared. They're less likely to have ever been diagnosed with a mental illness, right? These things are important, and part of what we're trying to do with the fund is begin to address the factors that lead to some of these underdiagnoses, the underutilization of care. In my other hat, I happen to be a researcher in treatment engagement specifically, trying to understand how do we get young people into treatment? What are the barriers? Not the financial barriers, the psychosocial barriers, right? And we know one of the biggest is stigma, right? So in some of our research, what we found is people have articulated to us, I'm already black. I don't need to be black and crazy, right? And so what they're speaking to is the exponential problems that occur when you have these multiple identities, and you layer on top of that a mental illness. We were talking last night, I was talking with a couple of colleagues about how everybody is touched. Everyone is touched by emotional challenges, developmental challenges, and mental health concerns. Everybody. Everybody in here knows what it feels like to be anxious. Everybody knows what it feels like to be sad and have a hard time coming out of the sadness. You've either experienced it yourself, you have a loved one who's experienced it, you know someone, you have a peer, and so these things are universal. And part of what we're trying to do is normalize this for people and help people understand, yes, I've been through it, I know someone who's been through it, it's okay that you're going through it, I want to help you. We want to normalize this help-seeking attitude, this help-seeking perspective. And so a young man I was talking to last night, I know I'm going to say his name wrong. I'm a former football player here. I think his name was Will. Oh, right here. There you go, my buddy, right? Just being very open. It's important. Having somebody like Brandon Marshall or Wayne Brady. Brandon Marshall's a football player. Wayne Brady's a comedian, an actor and singer, and he's amazing. Bless you. Talk about what their personal experiences have been with depression. That, with a depressive illness, that is mind-blowing, right? And for young people, that can be extremely powerful. Okay. So, again, why are we here? What do we feel like students of color want and need? Part of what we've done with the Steve Fund is also begun to do some research with the Steve Fund and the JED Foundation, where we're trying to understand what's out there that's working. What are you all already doing that has been beneficial for our young people? One example is at the University of Virginia, one of the Steve Fund advisors, Dr. Michael Mason, has an African-American peer counseling program. I think it's called Project Rise. It's been amazing. And so we want to know more about what else is happening, because people are doing good things. And we want to help to disseminate those things so that more young people of color have access to care. All right? And as you heard, Evan mentioned the 4 pillars of the Steve Fund. I just list them here. I won't repeat them because he's already spoken about them. But these are 4 key areas where the Steve Fund is working to try to make practical applications to ensure that our young people of color have their emotional well-being and mental health needs met. So I want to introduce, I'm just going to mention their names, Dr. Annelle Primm, the Senior Medical Advisor for the Steve Fund, who is going to speak next. And after her, Dr. David Rivera, a longtime colleague of mine who's worked with me on some other projects, as I've said. And they're both going to talk with you a little bit about what some of these specific kinds of challenges are. After they finish speaking, we're going to do a panel discussion, and hopefully we'll leave about 25 minutes at the end, fingers crossed, for you all to ask questions. And so what I want to ask is, when we get to the Q&A part, I would like the first 1 or 2 questions to come from students. Because we really want you to know how important you are to us. And so often, part of the work I do is community-engaged, community-based participatory research. And part of why that's important is because the key informants must be at the table. Otherwise, you're not doing CBPR, right? And so we want to model some of that here. That's very important to the fund. You all are the future. So we need to know what's important to you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Primm.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Breland-Noble, for your kind introduction. It's my pleasure to speak with you about raising awareness about the mental health of college students of color, and it's certainly been my pleasure to be a part of the Steve Fund team. Interesting, the concept of mental health. As a psychiatrist, I've been a psychiatrist for many years, and it wasn't maybe 10 years ago that I thought about mental health as a concept and what that was. And I think it's very important in this conversation to understand what that is. It involves effective functioning in a variety of daily activities that result in productivity in the workplace, in school, in caregiving roles. It also results in the establishment and maintenance of healthy relationships, and also incorporates the ability to adapt to change, which is inevitable for all of us, and the ability to cope with adverse circumstances and stress, which is also a given that all of us have to deal with. Mental illness, in contrast, is not necessarily the opposite of mental health. As you can see here, mental illness, rather, is a health condition that involves significant changes in mood, behavior, thinking, or some permutation of those three, causing distress or impairment in functioning in social, work, school, and family activities. So what about mental health, mental illness, and college students? First of all, the period between the teens and early adulthood in which college students are traversing is a very stressful period, can be quite a tumultuous period of development. And it's interesting that, starting at age 14, many of the common mental illnesses start having their onset. And by that time, about half of all mental illnesses appear. And by the age of 24, about 75% of mental illnesses appear. And these are illnesses like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, et cetera. In a recent survey that Dr. Breland-Noble made mention of, has revealed that 50% of college students feel stressed most or all of the time, and most don't seek help. And it's interesting that college students of color have even more pronounced experiences where they feel overwhelmed most or all of the time to a much greater degree than do their peers, and they are even more likely not to seek help for those problems. So this can really create a crisis situation for these individuals. One of the things that we haven't really talked about that much is why would the experiences of college students of color be different from their peers? And I think the answer lies in the social determinants of mental health. There is a recent book by Drs. Michael Compton and Ruth Shim called The Social Determinants of Mental Health from American Psychiatric Association Press, in which they identify 9 key social determinants of mental health, which actually happen to be the social determinants of health as well. And of the 9, I chose 5 of them, which I think could be operating in the experiences of college students of color and might explain some of the disparities in their experiences with regard to mental health and emotional well-being on college campuses. The first one, discrimination and social exclusion, is one that relates to some of the things that Dr. Breland-Noble mentioned. Our country has become quite racially polarized in recent years, and certainly college campuses are no exception to that. And some of the bias incidents and social exclusion that occur there certainly do not contribute to one's mental health. Adverse early life experiences are another factor. And regardless of socioeconomic status, we find that in studies like the ACEs study, that people who have adverse early life experiences, this portends poorer health and mental health in their adulthood and even premature death. So this is a very serious issue. Limited educational resources, this can be an issue in some of the communities around our country that are economically distressed and where there's been disinvestment in education. And even though very talented students may have excelled in those environments, when they come to an elite institution like the University of Michigan or other universities around the country, they may be at a disadvantage and may have to struggle. And sometimes they may be the first in their family to attend college, which may also add to some of the difficulties. income inequality, poverty, neighborhood deprivation, reduced access to health and mental health care, those things don't help either, because very often students of color will come to elite campuses and find that they're almost in a culture shock, given some of the kind of the overwhelming resources that are present there, being quite in contrast to some of what they have grown up with. This is not across the board, because certainly the experience of college students of color is not monolithic. There's a variety of kind of economic backgrounds and so forth, but these are just some of the points that some students from these backgrounds have to deal with. Dr. Breland-Noble also mentioned the current context and some examples of some of the highly publicized occurrences around the nation that involve bullying and racial bias against college students of color. And these environments on campuses, many of them predominantly white colleges and universities, can place students at risk for a number of experiences, including feeling marginalized and isolated and alienated from their fellow students. Some of them may experience a sense of stereotype threat, that they are concerned that in their actions or inactions that they may be reinforcing some of the negative stereotypes that society holds of the group from which they come. And a related issue is imposter syndrome, where people feel as if they are not worthy of being in that academic environment, that they cannot perform up to par, and are really an imposter, that they are not a real worthy, able student. And when people feel like the world is on their shoulders, that there's a burden for them to prove themselves worthy of their presence on campuses like these, it can really set the stage for depression, anxiety, and suboptimal academic performance. And for those who have a family history of mental health issues, these can certainly be triggers for the expression of those illnesses. So this brings me to what the Steve Fund is all about, in particular Pillar 3, which is awareness and dialogue. And we do seek to raise awareness about mental health, about mental illness, and in particular empower young people to be leaders in communicating to their peers and others the importance of mental health and well-being. And I think a very important point, risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors. And this means that all the risk factors that I talk about can be neutralized if we are intentional and deliberate about making sure the kinds of resources and supports are available on campus to help college students of color succeed. And so things like self-care and stress management and wellness activities are important, making sure mental health services are available to those students who need them. And while we might not be able to match students by race and ethnicity with the mental health professional, we could certainly make sure that the mental health professionals that they see are knowledgeable about some of the cultural issues and challenges that these students are facing, and thereby be more able to assist them in a culturally appropriate way. And then encouraging help seeking so that people don't suffer in silence, which can be quite dangerous. And of course, supporting those on-campus resources and supports that are in tune with the cultural background of students. And of course, they should also participate in the other supports and resources on campus for everyone, taking sort of a both-and approach. I'm going to stop there and thank you so much for your attention.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here as part of this amazing conference. I've already learned so much, and I'm also proud to be here representing the Steve Fund and presenting with my esteemed colleagues. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about issues that relate to Pillar 3, this awareness and dialogue pillar that the Steve Fund is invested in promoting. Has anybody heard of microaggressions? Raise your hand if you have. This is amazing. Great. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you anything new that you might not know about what they are, but I want us to think about microaggressions in relation to student health, to mental health. For the past 10 years, microaggression research has exploded, literally, in the psychological realm. And a lot of studies have investigated how microaggressions manifest, what they look like, the dynamics of microaggressions, but also how they impact well-being. I want us to also think about the context of the campus ecology, the campus environment. I want to kind of broaden it beyond just the individual student experience and think about the student in relation to the environments that they are learning and growing in. So just briefly, I want to make sure that for those of you that might not know what microaggressions are, but I think I saw nearly every hand go up, which is awesome, that microaggressions are these brief and very commonplace indignities. They can occur verbally through the interpersonal interactions that we have, the words that we say, the words that we don't say. They can manifest behaviorally through glances, through exclusion, through avoidance. And they can also be embedded in the environment. And I'm going to kind of focus us on that realm of microaggression, because I think that that's one of the most insidious forms of microaggressions. Probably the environmental microaggressions are the things that we are somewhat ignorant, most likely ignorant of, because we're just so used to seeing them. So we've kind of taken them for granted, but I think that we need to kind of expose them, make these invisible microaggressions visible. Well, all of these communicate hostility, derogation, they're negative, they're insulting towards all marginalized people, including people of color, women, LGBT individuals, poor people, people with disabilities, and the list goes on and on. There have been so many studies that have investigated various populations. One thing to focus on is the intentionality component, because this is often something that when you address a microaggression, the aggressor often will say, well, I didn't mean it. I didn't intend for it to happen. Well, quite frankly, I don't really care about intention that much. I care about the impact of our actions, of our words, of the environment on people. So we need to focus on that. This is kind of taking a new slant on discrimination. A lot of the original research focused on intentionality, but we're trying to now turn the focus to the impact that the marginalized person has in this interaction. People are often unaware of these, both the perpetrator and the aggressed. And I think that's also important to highlight, because that's one of the reasons why they often remain invisible and not discussed, right? So we want to increase dialogue around these issues. Thinking about how they manifest on the college campus, I can share the studies that give the themes, but I think that these images nicely represent what these students have experienced, and these are themes that we find in the research over and over again. This is from a BuzzFeed article that came out a few years ago. There were students at Fordham that wanted to raise awareness about their experiences with microaggressions, and so a number of students participated and held up signs with a frequent microaggression that they've experienced. And the first young man's holding a sign, and this is a kind of a combination of an environmental and interpersonal microaggression where he says, "The limited representation of my race in your classroom does not make me the voice of all black people." So this is environmental in that he's talking about how he is the numeric minority in his classroom situation. What is that noise? I'll speak over it. But it's also interpersonal because he's talking about the common experience of being called upon as the only black student in the classroom to be the voice of all black people. And this quality of microaggression or label of microaggression is this assumption of similarity. It was already mentioned that racial groups, any group is not a monolith, but they're often treated as a monolith. That's how these stereotypes come into play, where everyone is seen to be the same. The young woman in the middle holds up this sign, and this is a very common question, especially on college campuses where folks are coming from a number of areas, right? You often ask, where are you from? And that's a great question to ask, right? You're trying to learn more about a person's background, about their culture, about maybe what might influence them. But the microaggression occurs often for students of color that are Asian or Latino when the first answer isn't good enough and so really is stuck in there. So it's no, where are you really from? And the implication there is that, no, you're not from where you're saying. So you might be saying you're from California or Wyoming, which is my home state, but then I'm asked where I'm really from, and I try to get more detailed. Well, I'm from Cheyenne, Wyoming. No, where are you really from? And I'm like, well, are you trying to ask me what my ethnic background is? Which is okay to talk about that. We need to talk about race, ethnicity, but the implied message there is that, no, you're not from this country, you're from somewhere else. Right? There's this script that we have of what an American looks like, and this is something that is being talked about a lot right now because of the elections, and I won't get into that. We talked about it last night a lot, but I won't get into it right now. But this question is very othering. It kind of creates this feeling of being, and this is what people have said, an alien in their own land. I don't like that term alien, right, because we're human beings. But people are often thought to feel that way, which is very demeaning, very dehumanizing. And then this last one is one of my favorites, and I'm kind of twisted that way because I study microaggressions, so I do have some that are favorites because I experience this one often. So this young man says, when I gave a speech about racism, the MC introduced me as Jaime Garcia. My name is Jaime Rodriguez. Not all Latinos have the last name Garcia. And I experience this one often. My last name is Rivera, but I often will get Ramirez, Rodriguez, Martinez, Gonzalez, any other Latino name. And it's become a joke in my circle of friends, and that's often a coping mechanism that we use to deal with these types of isms. But what it is telling me is that the person doesn't really care to understand who I am enough to remember what my name is. And we know our names are extremely important parts of our identity. When your name is demeaned or attacked, that's an attack on yourself as a person. So this microaggression, I take quite personally because I experience it often, but it's also one that a lot of students of color might encounter. So I want to talk again about what happens. I want to couch this in not just these personal experiences, but what's going on in the environment that one lays the base for microaggressions to occur, but two, that keeps microaggressions alive, keeps these isms alive, keeps these issues alive. And one of the issues that people experience is representation. So you walk into a classroom, you walk into a college environment, and if you're a student of color, more often than not, you're going to be in an environment where you're the numeric minority amongst your peers. This is a survey taken from the National Center for Education Statistics, and this is looking at, students and faculty as if we represented one national university. So if we were one national university, we see that students of color would be a numeric minority, and these numbers often don't match they're not often representative of the numbers that are found in the general population. You look at faculty, and the picture gets even more bleak, and I'm a faculty member, so this one also impacts me personally. But if you think about the reason why students are on a college campus, it's to go to class, right, to get a degree. And so they're in these classrooms where their professors often don't look like them. And we know that when people are in environments where they don't have a physical match or they don't have a cultural match, that by itself, even without any kind of interpersonal interaction going on, can make someone feel othered. It sends a message about who belongs here and who doesn't belong here. It often sends the message that, well, you're here, but you're kind of an exception to the rule. Right? And that's also a type of microaggression. So I want us to think about this environment and what the students are kind of stepping into when they first arrive on campus. These types of microaggressions lead to a number of harmful impact on these students. There's a disengagement from the campus environment that's likely to occur. A lot of what we've been talking about at this conference has to do with engaging students, right? We want to engage students in mental health awareness, right? We want to engage students in help-seeking behaviors, right? But if a student feels like they are not a part of the campus environment, they're often going to be disengaged from that. And that's the first step of a lot of other things happening. If you disengage yourself from the campus environment, it's going to weaken your academic self-concept, right? This idea that I am a deserving learner, I am intellectual, I had the possibility to take in information and to grow as a scholar. It also weakens one's social support network, and again, that's what we've been talking a lot about here, about how that is often the lifeline of the student, literally, right? If they have a weakened support network and they're going through some kind of traumatic event, or they're having some kind of mental health issue, they're not going to have anybody to turn to. They're not going to have anybody to kind of identify that for them, right? So that's one thing that microaggressions can lead to. And then this inability to deal with isms, right? So students are going to encounter sexism, heterosexism, racism, a lot of other isms. And if one feels disengaged, if one doesn't have a lot of social support connections, they're not going to be able to deal with this ism in a positive way. And all of these kind of are connected and lead to maladaptive academic achievement and well-being in college students. Again, I wanted to think about this more as an environmental kind of issue. Here are a lot of the impacts. Again, there's been many studies. This is just a small representation, and they all lead to the same thing. Every study that has been done is negatively correlated with some kind of maladaptive or harmful well-being finding. We see that it's depression listed up here. We see that there are problematic behaviors such as binge drinking, which is often interrelated with depression and other types of symptoms. But thinking about the campus environment, I want to challenge us to not only focus our efforts on individual students who are going through crises, but we have to also kind of take a backwards approach and look at the entire environment. We need to treat the environment. I'm a counseling psychologist. I'm a scholar practitioner. My first practical work was in home-based family therapy, which emerged because people that were doing child therapy started to understand that you can do all you can to work with the child, but if you send them back into an environment that is probably has a big deal of the responsibility for their negative mental health or the symptoms that they have, those are just going to reemerge. So we can work with students. We can have the best protocols, the best treatments to work with students individually. But if we're just sending them back out into an environment where they're going to deal with these microaggressions, these hostilities, these insults, it's just going to kind of reduce or negate the efforts that we were putting forward. I leave us with a quote by Justice Sonia Sotomayor. This was in response to the affirmative action cases that were kind of a product of this state that the Supreme Court saw. And the one part of the judiciary was taking more of a colorblind stance to addressing race and racial issues. And Justice Sotomayor, on the other hand, challenged us to take another response. I recently came across a study of college presidents who were asked to rate the state of racial and ethnic affairs on their campuses and across the country. And a full 84% said that the state of race and ethnic affairs on their campuses were good or excellent. 84% believed that it was good or excellent. I have a ton of anecdotal evidence that can show otherwise. I also have statistics that can show otherwise. Well, we know this last semester there were two majorly televised and broadcasted instances at Yale and at the University of Missouri where students were saying, no, these issues, the campus is not promoting my culture, that the campus is actually doing things that are hurtful and that are negating my identity. I've worked at, or I've either worked or have attended 12 universities or colleges, and at every one of those, they're of varying types. There were always some kind of racial or ethnic issue going on. They're often invisible. They're often not treated as worth dealing with, but that's part of the issue that we need to deal with. And as Justice Sotomayor says, the refusal to accept the stark reality that race matters is regrettable. As members of the judiciary tasked with intervening to carry out the guarantee of equal protection, we ought not sit back and wish away, rather than confront the racial inequality that exists in our societies. And that means in every institution, in every context, including our institutions of higher education. So in the spirit of this defund's Pillar 3, we need to dialogue more about these issues, and we need to think about the broader context that our students are living day in and day out in. I'll stop there.
So I'm so glad he ended with the Justice Sotomayor. She's like an idol. I love her. And I don't idolize a lot of people, but she and Michelle Obama, they're like rock stars to me. So we're gonna have one question with the panel, and then I want to leave maybe one or two, and then I want to have, because I think we ended 10:15. Can somebody nod their head, tell me if that's right? Okay. And we want to have an opportunity to hear from you. So the first question I want to ask the panel is something that's practical. And I would ask all of our panelists, what one piece of advice do you have for students, parents, families, or university administrators regarding the mental health needs of students of color? So one piece of advice you would like to share with everyone, and you all go right ahead.
I think I'll just echo one of the points I made earlier, in that we need to be conscious and deliberate about making campuses welcoming for people. And when I talk with folks around the country and students who have felt alienated, having groups that they can belong to, affinity groups or houses where folks from their cultural background live together. These are the sorts of things. I mean, it's different for each campus, and each campus can find what works best for them. But I think making these sorts of intentional and deliberate efforts to create an embrace that kind of addresses the culture of that person or that group is critically important for their comfort level in that environment.
I would also, is this on?
I think
Okay.
so.
I would also add to that that it's often helpful just to be aware of the issues that a student is going to encounter when they go to college. And I think that new student orientation programs attempt to do this, and they do this for a good deal of the issues, such as expect to feel homesick, right? Expect to feel challenges academically, because there's going to be a difference between what you were doing in high school and what you're going to be expected to do in college level coursework. Expect a certain level of independence, right? Especially important for students to know that, as they're coming from a system that was more protected, more than likely. But also expect to experience adversity, right? I think that we're not going to be able to solve these issues in a matter of months or years or even decades. They're long-standing issues, and it's going to take a while for us to kind of get to a place where they're adequately addressed. But in the meantime, we need to prepare students for the fact that they are more than likely going to experience adversity, so that they can prepare themselves to deal with that once they step foot on campus.
Okay. Evan, did you want to add?
Yeah, sure. I think from the student perspective, sometimes isolation can be self-perpetuating, and I would be loath to say that there's any reason for somebody to not seek help for it. You should definitely go and seek help if you're feeling isolated and if you're feeling like you haven't connected with your peers. And I know that the longer that happens for folks in college, especially during the early years, the more likely it is that they're not going to fall into the groups that start to form later on, and that can be very difficult. So as early as you can, if you're having those issues or if you're feeling isolated, definitely go out there and seek help.
Okay, thank you so much. So one additional question that it makes me think of. For many of us who are on predominantly white college campuses, I happen to be a graduate of an HBCU, as is my colleague, Dr. Primm, go Bison, Howard University. And I'm a Bison, I bleed. If you cut me, I'm gonna bleed blue and white. But anyway, for those of us who aren't at those kinds of institutions, for those of us who work at predominantly white institutions where we do have many students of color, are there bits of advice or are there ways in which on the majority culture campuses, what kinds of things can these campuses do to support our students of color? So you've spoken to it from the perspective of, we can educate students. Evan has talked about how young people of color should not isolate themselves, but are there practical things that we can tell people to help them in developing programming, in outreach, and what kinds of things would you all suggest or might you recommend that feel practical and might be doable to implement on some of these campuses?
Well, I think the suggestions I made before were along those lines. I mean, that's what some campuses have done. For instance, Stanford has some dorms that are for Latino students, and one student who was at one of our Steve Fund programs spoke to the fact that prior to being in that dorm, she felt very much isolated and alienated, and upon moving in there, she felt much more comfortable. And so, that may or may not be practical for all campuses, but that's one example. There was also at Stanford again, a American Indian Students Center that actually welcomed the students and their parents and their families when they first came to Stanford. And that has become a cultural center that people go to throughout their college years, and really helps to kind of bridge that gap between a culture that the American Indian students come from, where it's a culture of sharing and collectivism, versus coming to a campus like Stanford, where competition is the focus. So having that kind of culturally familiar touchstone has helped, make the difference. So, when we have knowledge of the cultures of the students that attend a given university, we can then be creative about what kinds of supports to develop. And of course, get some feedback from those students themselves.
I'm going to piggyback on that really quickly. So that's a really interesting perspective from the institutional side of things, and I think that in addition to the institutional side, it's really important to also create spaces where students themselves can go and put together groups, and they can feel as though they're comfortable sharing a lot about themselves. So I know at Harvard, this may be super anecdotal, but there were these things that we had called steins, and basically it was a space where people would come together and you could share different cultures. And I mean, people would make their own types of food, and they would come together and talk about the kind of drinks that they drank in their home countries, or whether, where they're from. And what it did was everybody could go there, and under the guise of, free kegs, people could hang out and just talk about all sorts of different things. So making people feel comfortable, with themselves and with the space, and that they felt like they weren't going to be attacked for anything because everybody was sharing. That was really powerful, and it created a lot of friendships and a lot of connections, across different cultural boundaries.
Yeah, we need to, and this has been also a message I've heard here, as to resist this one-size-fits-all model of attending to students, regardless of the population. But for students of color, we also need to hear their voices, right? And so we need to engage them. We need to create advisory boards for our mental health service providers. We also need to rethink the way that we engage in service provision, right? For a lot of communities, mental health is a stigma, right? And we know this in general. Seeking mental health is a stigma in many communities of color. And so we need to rethink, how do we provide that? If they're not going to come to us, well, we need to go to them. I know I used to work at Georgetown University, and we had a nice alliance with I worked for the Multicultural Affairs Office, and we had a nice alliance with our Counseling and Psychological Services Office. And we had always somebody, a partnership with a clinician who was culturally competent, who would come to our offices and hold office hours there. And would also engage with students in non-traditional psychological therapy type encounters or interactions, right? More maybe in groups or coming to events, right? So it's kind of rethinking the way that we provide service. I think that can really help us in many ways.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So with that, I would like to ask students first. Don't be shy to come up to the mic and ask any questions or make any comments that you all might have. So the floor is yours. Thank you, brave soul. Appreciate it.
Hi. I have a question. The strategy you guys mentioned it seems like you guys geared it toward four-year universities. I do know community colleges enroll significant amount of students of minority, marginalized populations. I'm wondering what unique strategies can be implemented in those colleges and universities, or if the strategies that you mentioned can be also applied to those settings as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, does anybody want to take that?
I think community colleges are often challenged. I have worked at 2 community colleges as well in counseling and in advising, and I've noticed that the approaches for both had to be changed a little bit. Most community colleges are going to be commuter colleges, so we have to take that into consideration off the back, right? And so we not we're not going to be the only person providing services, so we might have to do a lot more collaboration with community partners, and also with families if they're living with their families. There might be more of a collaboration that needs to take place there. So I think that that's one short answer to a very complicated question for a set of challenges that community colleges have, but recognizing and honoring that many students are going to be commuter students, so we need to engage with a wider community. We can't just focus on what's going on that particular campus.
I think one thing I would add to that is I'm very proud of him, so I have to shout him out. I have a cousin who is a community college president. His name is Dr. Breland. My name's Breland-Noble, go figure. So Dr. Breland is at San Jose City College, and one of the things that he talks about, Byron, is that you engage early, as Dr. Rivera said, and intensely, right? Because you have a condensed period of time within which to work with the students. And I think one of the things he's talked about, he's also an advisor to the fund, is he has talked about creative ways to engage students. And so part of it is, he has this, I'm not gonna say it right, but he has this comment that he makes about, it's really hard to care about your mental health when you're trying to figure out how you're gonna eat, or when you're trying to figure out how you're going to pay tuition, right? And so for many of these students, what he's saying is they're first-generation college students. They don't have a lot of resources, so they have to tie emotional well-being and mental health to sort of these practical outcomes, right? If you take care of your mental health, that's going to help you get through this semester. If you get through this semester, that's going to help you get this internship that we have set up for you with some, business that we've worked with. And so what he tries to do is really integrate this into their daily lives so that it doesn't feel, it's a holistic approach, so that it doesn't feel like, the thumb on the hand, there's all this other stuff, and then there's your mental health, and you can kind of take care of it, but, it's really not that important. So I definitely think there are ways. I would encourage looking on their website. But I do think we have colleagues out here. I think we have some colleagues represented here from community colleges who can speak to the ways that they do it. So in addition to what my colleague, Dr. Rivera, has mentioned, I think it's really engage early, engage intensely, engage often, and really try to tie these outcomes to sort of their practical life skills. What's going to help me make progress in my primary goal, which is getting this degree. So hopefully that's helpful. Yes?
Hi. So I was sort of a two-part question. One is, in hearing your conversation about microaggressions, I sort of had the thought about, sort of similar to the conversation about sexual assault on college campuses, the importance of educating the perpetrators and preventing it from happening, not just dealing with the aftermath and things like that. So I was wondering what you guys think or know about the effectiveness of, I guess, we don't really have microaggression training, but a lot of colleges have mandatory, a lot of colleges have mandatory diversity training at least, and the importance of that. As well as another idea that I was having when you were talking about representation was how important is it to have, on university counseling centers, to have therapists or counselors of color?
So I can take the first one, and I'll let my colleague, who's the microaggressions guru, take I'll take the second one, he can take the first one. So in terms of representation, as Dr. Primm mentioned, I personally don't think it's necessary for me to go into the counseling center and see a black person. I do think it is important for me to go into the counseling center and see some racial diversity, right? So I think the key is people need to feel like there's somebody at that center who knows what it feels like to be isolated on this campus. There's somebody at that center, so there's one thing that often happens I think it's in communities of color in general. I know this is in black communities. People don't refer to me as Alfiee, right? And that's a little bit of a paradigm shift for faculty, because a lot of faculty say, oh, call me by my first name. Black folks don't do that, because there's this knowledge. We know how hard it was for you to get that degree, right? So we're gonna respect you and honor you. We're gonna call you doctor no matter what. So I have a really close girlfriend. She and I have worked together for a long time. She's a little bit older than I am. She's like a big sister. We're buddies, and she calls me Dr. A. So I think there are those kinds of sort of nuances of understanding that if you go into a counseling center and there's nobody who looks like you, you're not sure, right? I was talking to a colleague, I think she's Kelly from Notre Dame, and we were just having this conversation. And I said to her, there's this thing that people do in communities of color. Now, my colleagues may say I'm completely wrong and I'm an N of one, but when you're traveling, when you get to a city, I'm gonna tell you what I do. I scan and make sure I see somebody brown. Once I see the first brown person, I'm like, okay, I can breathe. But if I don't, then I'm like, I don't know how, I don't know how people are gonna encounter me. So it's not to say that I assume everybody's racist, I don't. but I don't know what their level of experience is with people who look like me or people of color. So I think those are the kinds of things that why representation matters. I need to just see something, some pictures on the wall, somebody other than the administrative staff being of color. So that's why representation matters. It's just a quick visual cue that says, I might be okay here, I can breathe. So I'll let Dr. Rivera and my colleagues keep going on that.
Yeah, in addition to that representation, the issue of cultural competency is where a lot of effort should be placed as well, right? So like Dr. Alfiee said, you don't need to necessarily see a person of color if you're a person of color. You don't necessarily need to see a woman if you're a woman. But what you do need to see is somebody who's culturally competent about the areas and issues that are impactful to your daily life. Addressing the microaggression question, I think more and more universities are incorporating this talk about microaggressions. A lot are doing stuff within new student orientation. A lot are doing it within the residence halls. It needs to be done more. But I think that we can actually learn from some of the sexual assault programming that's being done. There's bystander training that's being done with sexual assault. And that same kind of framework could be applied to microaggressions, right? Because it's a form of assault. Right? And we know that when a bystander interjects within a microaggressive encounter, that bystander, sometimes from the perspective of the enactor or the perpetrator, can be seen as more objective. So I might be more willing to listen to that perspective as opposed to the person who's saying, no, you harmed me this way. So I think that we can take that framework, and that's something that we can really learn from in terms of what's done with sexual assault programming.
And I'm going to let Dr. Primm make her comments, but I wanted to shout out our colleagues from UT Austin. Dr. Primm spoke very highly of they have a bystander training that they do on their campus, so find those UT folks because clearly they're doing something right. But go ahead, Dr. Primm.
Yeah, I just wanted to add with respect to culturally competent therapists. I think the beginning is having cultural humility and being ready to ask questions, ready to understand, to be open to what the person before you who is different is experiencing. And you know, there are sometimes, even with ethnic or racial matching of therapist and patient, it may not be a good fit. So it's not all about what the person looks like or what their background is. You know, there are other proximal factors along which the person receiving services and the mental health professional can connect on. So I think it's important for us to recognize that, you know, the kinds of mental health professionals that are recruited to a student counseling center need to be those who have that characteristic of cultural humility and could really see and help anyone.
Absolutely. So I have this it's not a great story, but it's an interesting story. So I was at a multicultural counseling meeting. This is the meeting I was talking about. Dr. Rivera is co-planning right now with his team. And we had this thing where I'm from Virginia Beach by way of Mississippi. And so we have this comment we always say, just checking in with somebody, we say, are you straight? Right, you straight, you good? So I said that, and I was talking to a young Latino gay male. So, you straight? He was like, what do you mean am I straight? What kind of question is that? And I had to take a step back because I didn't know what he was talking about. And after a couple of minutes, I said, oh my gosh. So the cultural humility piece, like I could have said, oh, I didn't even mean it like that. I just had to say, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. As Dr. Rivera said, it's not about intent. I didn't mean it, and thank you for educating me. So I think when people can do things like that and just stop. Just say, oh my gosh, I did not know. I apologize. I don't think it helps to say I didn't mean it, which I did, but which was wrong. But just to say, can you educate me? Tell me what I did wrong so that I won't make that mistake again. And I feel like, as Dr. Primm said, if someone can do that, that can really completely change the context of the interpersonal interaction and really build that therapeutic alliance, regardless of what the race of the folks are. So I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi there, my name is Janelle Goodwill, and I'm a PhD student here in psychology and social work. And so I'm wondering, do you think that there are some unique stressors that graduate students of color may experience? And if so, do you think that some of the strategies that have been talked about today, for instance, some of the things that are going on at Stanford, could really be kind of shifted or targeted for graduate students of color who may be experiencing some of these same stressors and unique pressures?
You guys want to take that?
One issue, I just recently spoke to a program that's funded by the federal government to help increase the numbers of people of color in drug research. And one thing that came up over and over again is this idea of survivor guilt, this idea that I've made it, but how did I make it? Did I make it at the cost of other people? I made it. I'm not able to pull everyone with me to this level. So as people get educated at each level, I think that kind of intensifies, and that's something that needs to be processed, because that can actually serve as a hindrance to further success, but also it can amplify any kind of issue that's already going on for the person. So I think that having conversations about that experience and what's going on, there are some unique differences as people traverse these areas, as they get into academia, as they get into the professorate, where there are just also representation becomes smaller and smaller as you go higher, right? And so I think that also is something that needs to be focused as well.
I've heard from graduate students that they are questioned by the undergraduate students who they might be teaching in teaching assistant roles, and they might be questioned, and there's wonder whether or not this teaching assistant can really be an effective teacher given their status as a graduate student of color. And I think that those kinds of experiences, kind of microaggressions, it's helpful if there's a critical mass, and that if people look across the campus at graduate students maybe who are not in your particular discipline, but that you have some space or opportunity to come together and just talk and unload. Because I think it's in the collective experience, in the connection, that we can find some solace and some comfort, and to be able to stay by supporting each other and sharing some of those experiences. I think just having an opportunity to ventilate about them and problem solve together about how to respond with these sorts of experiences is very helpful.
Absolutely. And then one other thing I would add to what my esteemed colleagues have mentioned is that we want to teach graduate students of color the rules of the game, rules of engagement, right? So some of the unwritten stuff that nobody says, right, about no is probably never the right answer. When a faculty member asks you, I'm talking about something in the professional realm, if they're asking you to be on a paper, if they're asking you to join the lab, that you really have to think about when no is okay and when it's not, but you need people to help you do that, right? And so we want our young people, our graduate students of color, to understand there are all these unwritten rules. It's like an iceberg. What you see is a tip, there's all this stuff underneath the surface. And so we really want to be able to help them understand so they can make informed decisions, because maybe no is the right answer. But you got to know in what context no is the right answer, because you're also trying to progress and make a career, and we want to see you in the professoriate, as Dr. Rivera said. We want you to get there. So in addition to what they've said, I definitely think understanding what you're dealing with and going in with eyes wide open is critically important, and I think can contribute. If you know what you're dealing with, it doesn't really sort of come out of nowhere when you encounter these roadblocks and hit these walls. You kind of know what you're up against. So with that, I want to thank everyone for asking questions, in particular our students. Thank you all for your time and attention, and it's been a pleasure.